Hi, in this video I'd like to talk about the differences and similarities between the grey wolf and the domestic dog, and whether we should be feeding our pet dogs on the same diet as their wild ancestor, the grey wolf. So first of all, let's look at some differences and similarities between the two. So both dogs and wolves belong to the taxonomic order Carnivora, and there are about 260 species in this order, but they're not all carnivores or meat eaters, which is a little bit confusing. But it does also include the giant panda, which is completely herbivorous. It survives on plant material of bamboo. And it does include omnivores such as the badger, bear and fox, and of course the dog that we're going to discuss further. On a genetic basis, dogs and grey wolves are very, very similar. So they share 99.8% of their mitochondrial DNA with each other. However, on a genetic basis, chimpanzees and humans share 98.8% DNA. But if you look at the two species side by side, we are quite different. One of the other differences between wild wolves and dogs would be the energy requirements they need. So obviously they have very, very different lifestyles, and a wolf would needs 3.2 times more energy from its diet than a domestic dog does. But let's look at how dogs might have evolved, and to do that we need to actually look at a bit of a history of humans as well. So humans have been cooking food for a very long time. There's no general consensus, but it could be as far back as 1.8 million years ago. What we do know though is that cooking in controlled hearths actually started 400,000 years ago, and cooking starchy foods started 120,000 years ago. And why is this important for dogs? Well, dogs actually became domesticated by hanging around human settlements, by scavenging from leftovers and scraps, and so therefore they're going to have been eating some starchy leftovers and potentially some cooked starchy leftovers. And that's because the domestication of dogs started between 12 and 16,000 years ago. So that's actually a very long time that dogs have been living with humans and eating leftovers, and that's quite a long time to have been able to evolve potentially. So there was a study from 2021, and I'll put the link in the description under this video, of an archaeological site from late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, and they found remains of dogs that had very, very varied diets. Some of the dogs were carnivores, some were omnivores, but some of the dogs had a diet that was almost exclusively plant-based matter, including grains and millet. And in fact, those dogs had a diet that was very, very similar to cows actually found at the same archaeological site. So it's really interesting to see that as far back as the Bronze Age, dogs were consuming some sorts of carbohydrate type foods. And another study from 2014 looked at the British grey wolf in the Pleistocene era. And they actually found, the researchers in this study actually found that the wolves had evolved slightly in response to ecological changes in the insects and plant matter available. So they actually developed shallower jaws for smaller prey and wider molars for crushing food rather than for shearing flesh. So there are some changes there as well. But probably most importantly are the changes that we can see between the genes that are used for starch, digestion and metabolism between dogs and wolves. So the most well-known study was on a gene called AMY2B, and that gene codes for pancreatic amylase. Now, pancreatic amylase actually breaks down starch, and wolves have 2 copies of this gene, whereas dogs have between 4 and 30 copies of this gene, so are much more capable of digesting starch. Although it's interesting that there are differences between breeds because of the wide range in copies of genes. So some dog breeds may not be able to digest starch as well as others. But there are other genes as well. You've got MGAM, which converts maltose into glucose, and in dogs there is a 2-fold increase in the conversion between maltose and glucose than there is in wolves. There are also differences between dogs and wolves in a gene which is SGLT1, and that's involved in the transport of glucose. So there are quite a few differences showing that dogs have evolved from wolves and may be able to digest a different diet. So I hope that's been interesting, and I will leave it up to you to decide whether you think that dogs should be eating the same as their wild ancestors or whether they've now changed and adapted to eat a different diet. Thank you for listening.